Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. And today we're going to have a good conversation about nuclear weapons. I'm sure that's what everybody wants to think about today. It's not exactly what people really like to talk about, but we really need to talk about this because it's a serious business. And about 5 years ago, a fellow named Ward Wilson came to Toronto. And he came largely because a woman named Martha Goodings was raving about how wonderful his book was. So we put on a dinner, and got all her friends to come. And we had a wonderful dinner in a restaurant where he gave a talk about his book. And on other occasions, she would go around giving talks about his book because she really thought it was great. Well, it's still an important book. And we still need to think about all the things that he discussed there. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about that book, 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons. And we're going to talk with Ward Wilson, who's in Illinois, someplace outside of Chicago. And we're going to talk with Martha Goodings, who's here in Toronto, but I never get to see her because of the pandemic, and maybe our paths don't cross anyway. But hello, Ward Wilson. How are you?
Hello, it's nice to be here. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you. And hello, Martha Goodings.
Hello, and I'm glad to see Ward again after all these years. And it's always nice to touch base with Metta. We're all getting so used to doing it, virtually, that I hope that once we don't have to do it virtually, we don't forget our social skills when we meet in person. But we live in hope, and it's very nice to be joining everyone today.
All right. So we still have these damn things called nuclear weapons, and they haven't gone away, and they're still as dangerous as ever, maybe more so. And so we have to go back and think about some of the points that actually were so beautifully summarized in that book 5 years ago, 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons. So, Ward, give us a little synopsis or something about that book, and forgive us if we interrupt you with objections and comments.
Excellent. I think this book is now 5 years old. I'm working on a new book called The Realist Case for Eliminating Nuclear Weapons.
And we'll talk about that another time.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. But I think if I were going to characterize what the two books are, 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons is essentially a collection of doubts. It's questions about nuclear weapons. It takes things that are widely believed and says, well, now, is that really true? And then the new book is kind of a more positive case for why it's possible to get rid of nuclear weapons and in a realistic way. So today will be doubts.
All right.
I think the most important reason for imagining that we should doubt things about nuclear weapons is that it's a subject that has very few facts. When you think about it, here's a weapon that has only ever had one field test, bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if you think about the history of weapons in general, it actually takes quite a long time and a great deal of experience to understand the full potential or limitations of a weapon. Machine guns were invented in the 1860s and used for 50 years. And even so, when World War I broke out in 1914, people still hadn't assimilated the rules and capabilities that you have to use when you are fighting with machine guns. So if you think about how little data we have about nuclear weapons, one field test, maybe some questionable, difficult to pin down data from nuclear crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And essentially that's it.
Well, but there were thousands of tests in the Pacific and in Australia and in North Africa and places like that. Just thank goodness they tried to avoid hurting people. They actually
that's true.
So yeah.
Well, that's true, and that is the objection that nuclear weapons believers generally make. They say, we know all we need to know about nuclear weapons. But in fact, that's not true. You can use a weapon on the testing ground as much as you want. And people surely did use machine guns on the testing ground. And yet, when they got into actual full-fledged battle on the battlefields of France in World War I, they kept sending masses of men charging across open ground at machine guns, and the dead would be lined up in rows. Somehow, what testing does is it gives you an idea about the physics of a weapon. But military utility is not just physics, it's how people react, it's where it's best to use, it's how you fit it in with all the other circumstances of a battle or a war. So knowing that you've exploded a weapon and that it creates so much overpressure and so many fires and so on doesn't tell you whether or not the Japanese surrendered because we dropped nuclear weapons on them. Doesn't tell you whether someone else would surrender if we dropped a nuclear weapon on them. What it tells you is, you can crush this kind of building or burn that kind of plant. And battle is a complicated, human, multifaceted thing. And the reactions and responses of thousands of human beings determine the outcome of the battle. And before you can take a weapon and understand it, you have to see it in action. At least that is the lesson of history. There's never been a weapon that was completely understood before you took it into battle and tried it, used it under real circumstances. So I think,
to be honest, I think I don't want to hear too much along this line, because I know there are some military people who are in fact looking forward to an opportunity to do exactly what you're proposing, go out and have some more fun with them. So I
think there were. I don't know that there's military people. I think all the people now honestly don't think that you can win a war with nuclear weapons, but I think it's useful for other reasons, psychological reasons, power reasons, deterrent reasons, whatever reason. I haven't heard, Ward, you can correct me too, I haven't heard people really actually postulating you can win a war with nuclear weapons.
Yes, I don't know. I don't hang out with these people. But in the last 2 months, I am sure I have read about people in NATO who are saying, well, we've got these things, so let's figure out how to use the tactical nuclear weapons in a real battle. And otherwise, why would we have such an expensive thing and can't hang on to them so long? I don't know them by name, but I've heard that there are people thinking that way. Let's hope that I'm wrong and that you're right. Anyway.
Well, Ward will know because she's more familiar. Is that?
Well, I think you're both right. I think, Martha, in terms of the general trend, I think that's right. Fewer and fewer people have talked about fighting a war with nuclear weapons. We withdrew all of our tactical nuclear weapons from Europe in the early 1990s. Obviously,
but there are tactical nuclear weapons there in Europe now.
There are a handful. Tactical,
not long range or even medium range, but there are still tactical nuclear weapons in Europe.
There are. We withdrew almost, but we had like 10,000 tactical weapons, and now there are 150 or 200. And it's a token. But the reason that I think utility is important, it's not because I want to be bloodthirsty, but I think that what we've learned over 70 years is that there's no question that nuclear weapons are immoral. And that ought to be enough to persuade us, but it isn't. Governments today are introducing new weapons. The Russians, Chinese, developing new weapons. They're increasing their arsenals. Pakistanis, the Chinese are adding to their nuclear arsenals. The U.S. is going on a modernization, and I think that what that says is that the argument that says they're dangerous and immoral hasn't carried the day. So we need a new way of arguing about nuclear weapons. And I think utility is is the way to go, because you're talking about reality when you talk about the usefulness of nuclear weapons. And not even generals can argue with reality. Reality is reality. If the facts don't support the notion that nuclear weapons are powerful and useful weapons, then they're not powerful and useful weapons. So, but anyway, so the overview of the book is 5 myths. The first is nuclear weapons won World War II. 2 bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced the Japanese to surrender. The second is the H-bomb revolution. There's a belief that nuclear weapons are decisive because they're so big, but there's a troubling trend that seems to put the lie to that. The third is deterrence. We tend to believe that experts and government officials say that deterrence works, but the evidence is not as clear-cut as they say. Another argument, the fourth, is there's an argument made that there's been a long peace of 60, 75 years in the world between nuclear powers, and that therefore nuclear weapons have this magic ability to keep people from ever fighting wars, which is a partly true thing, but is dangerous if you embrace it too much. And the last is this notion that nuclear weapons can never be disinvented, and therefore we have to just hunker down and learn to live with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I agree that I've heard all of those arguments, or at least maybe they're more like assumptions. I don't know how many people actually argue forcefully in those for them, but sometimes you do. Certainly, number one is, I think, probably the most controversial part of your book, isn't it? Or the most interesting, because it got the most attention. The one about Hiroshima winning the war. And I'm sure that most people, well, at least most Americans, I don't know whether about the rest of the world, but most Americans that I know probably do believe that. So I think we ought to talk about that one more than anything else immediately, don't you?
Fine, we can start there. The thing about Hiroshima is it violates the rules of war, or the history of strategy and warfare. If you go back through history, it violates it in 2 ways. If you go back in history and look for an occasion when one country or one group captured an enemy city and leveled it, destroyed it, burned it to the ground, and then the other side surrendered because the city had been destroyed. I cannot find an instance in history in which that ever occurred. Wartime leaders don't surrender because civilians are killed, apparently. And the other is that when a great power joins a war, everyone who is involved, all the different parties involved in the war, stop and recalibrate their chances of being able to win. So wars in the 1400s, 1600s. So the 30 Years' War, when Sweden comes into the war, they're a pretty big power at the time, and everyone has to recalibrate, okay, can we still achieve our objectives? Hiroshima violates both those longstanding rules of war that occur throughout history. It says we bombed 2 cities and the Japanese surrendered because we bombed those 2 cities. And it says when the Russians came into the war, the Russians were at the time the greatest land power on earth. They had the most men under arms in their army of any of the combatants in the world. And when they joined the war against Japan on Thursday, the midnight of Wednesday, August 8th, so effectively Thursday the 9th, which is 3 days after we bombed Hiroshima, when they joined the war, it would make sense that everyone would stop and recalibrate and say, well, can we still achieve our objectives? And if the Japanese totally ignored the entry of a great power into the war in their calculations about surrender, then that would be very surprising. So for the Hiroshima story, as usually known to be true, two surprising, unlikely things have to be true, which means that the proof that Hiroshima caused Japan to surrender has to be very high. The bar has to be set high. It has to be, a lot of evidence has to show that it was definitely the bomb in order for us to believe this unlikely set of claims. Unfortunately, the evidence that the bomb won the war is quite ambiguous at best. For example, on the 15th, the emperor goes on the radio and announces.
Now, wait a minute. Let's
Okay.
try to make our dates. I'm pretty hazy about this memory. Okay, the 8th was Hiroshima, right? No, the 6th was Hiroshima.
6th, Monday the 6th.
And Monday, and the 9th was Nagasaki.
Thursday, correct.
Thursday is Monday and Thursday. And
Right.
and then when did the Soviets enter the war?
Soviets enter the war midnight Wednesday. So the day, the night,
Before Nagasaki was bombed.
right. And one of the reasons that it makes sense that it was the Russians rather than the bomb is because of that timing. We bomb Hiroshima on Monday, and then Tuesday goes by, and Wednesday goes by, and Monday goes by, all of Monday, because we do it in the morning. Tuesday, Wednesday, essentially they do nothing for 3 days. The Soviets declare that they're going to enter the war, and they invade Sakhalin Island and the southern half of Sakhalin Island and Manchuria beginning at midnight on Wednesday. And suddenly on Thursday morning, military leaders meet in an emergency session. They discuss grabbing the emperor and declaring martial law. And there is, for the first time in 14 years of war, a meeting of the Supreme Council, the ruling body of Japan, in order to discuss the possibility of unconditional surrender. Now, there's no emergency meeting of military guys on Monday morning after Hiroshima was bombed. There's no emergency discussion about grabbing the emperor and setting up a military dictatorship on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday after Hiroshima was bombed. Mm-hmm. There's no meeting of the Supreme Council on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday after Hiroshima was bombed. But as soon as the Soviets come into the war, all these things happen that seem to indicate a crisis. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't seem like it was Hiroshima that caused them to surrender. And it can't have been Nagasaki, because they're sitting in the meeting of the Supreme Council on Thursday morning when news of Nagasaki arrives. Mm. So they'd already decided that there was a crisis by the time the Nagasaki bombing happened. So timing's a big factor.
I think that when I read your arguments, I believe your arguments are true, but in a way, I don't think they're going to work. I've thought of this quite a bit since then, because I think several things can be true. I think that in a way, the bombing did enable the war to end, because even if it wasn't the technical cause of it, it did give the emperor an out. It enabled him to say, because of this terrible weapon, I have to resign. So it did enable the war to end in that way. And I also think for the it's very difficult to counteract a myth, an emotion with factuals, and so telling all the details isn't going to work, I don't think. I think you can show that it wasn't the only thing, but I think it helped. It did give the emperor an ability to with honor, I suppose, say that he would agree to a surrender.
Now, wasn't there, excuse me, because I don't have the book in front of me and I haven't looked at it in 5 years, but along about then, whether it was in your book or someplace else, I remember hearing that there had been released or made public for the first time some minutes of the cabinet meeting of the Japanese, the cabinet in Japan, and that the discussion, the record of that conversation, as as it took place indicated that what they were really reacting to was the entry of the Soviets into the war, and that's what was really on their minds, and that they, if anything, maybe I'm really reading, piling things on that are not really in the record, but that they were used to being firebombed. Their cities were already being obliterated every other night, practically, with American firebombing, and so they kind of wrote this off as another. There goes another city, like.
Yeah, they said it would make the war effort more difficult and so forth. So that's what I mean. Two things can be true. It can be true that it was actually the Russians entering into the war that stopped it, but also, I mean, it did give the atom bomb did give a good cover and enabled the emperor to surrender.
Well,
Okay.
what did he say when he announced to the Japanese people that they were going to surrender? What explanation did he give? Did he mention the bomb?
No, yeah, he did.
So here's the thing. The emperor's evidence, which is often cited by people who think that the Japanese surrendered because of the bomb, is important to pay attention to. On the 15th, there's a radio broadcast. The emperor's voice is recorded, and he says, "We have to surrender. The enemy is using a new and most terrible bomb." He doesn't say nuclear weapon explicitly, but he indicates the bomb. And that seems to suggest that it was the bomb that forced them to surrender. There are two
and
things.
He wanted that said. Yeah, that's the impression he wanted given. Yeah.
One is political leaders don't always say what's in their innermost hearts or explain their decisions truthfully in public.
Right. Fair enough.
They say whatever they think is useful. What's useful to remember is that 2 days later, on the 17th, I believe, the emperor issued a second rescript, an official proclamation that was delivered to all the armed forces of Japan. And that said, we have to surrender because the Soviets have come into the war. And it didn't mention the atomic bomb at all. So this evidence that the emperor believed it was the bomb is contradicted by a very important source, the emperor himself.
I believe that the emperor did not believe. I mean, he didn't believe that it was the bomb, but it did give him something useful to say. I think that comes out in Hasegawa's book, when he talks about what went on. And to me, that's useful. I mean, people never really say what's in their deepest heart, but his first reaction, it was useful to him, and whether he believed it or not, it got him through, so to speak. So,
So that's fine. So let's look at this from a utility point of view, from a military utility point of view. First, will we always be facing an adversary who needs an excuse in order to do what he wants to do? Second, will nuclear weapons provide that excuse, or will that adversary need some other excuse? It may be that there were some very special circumstances operating in Japan. Is that a reason to believe that nuclear weapons are weapons that can coerce anyone or that can deter any attack? The problem with the notion that Japan's leaders were shocked into surrendering is that they weren't shocked.
No, they just said they were.
And the reason they weren't shocked is that we had bombed 66 other cities that summer. If you graph all 68 attacks from the summer, Hiroshima is second in terms of the number of people immediately killed. Tokyo killed more people. If you graph the square miles destroyed, Hiroshima is sixth in terms of square miles destroyed. If you graph the percentage of the city destroyed, Hiroshima is 17th. If Japan was going to surrender because a city got bombed, why didn't they surrender because of the other 66 cities that were bombed throughout the summer of 1945? The problem with clutching at the bomb is that it's a way to rationalize a belief that you want to believe. It's not something that is in line with the facts. And as far as abolishing myths goes, I think the only way to get rid of myths is with reality. I think reality is the only tool we have for dismissing myths.
You have more faith in realistic thinking than I do, but my thought is that it is a myth, but then you can then say the myth could work in that instance because the bomb was really basically small. It was basically, it didn't cause more damage than all the other conventional weapons, although it was only one bomb and they were thousands. I think the argument other people are taking now is Hiroshima was sort of a one-off. The bombs we have now are so enormous that it's not, they are completely unuseful. I think in a way, I don't know how to say it, but you have to let the myths, you have to build on the myths. By the time you spend all your time trying to say, no, Americans, you were wrong, everyone just stops thinking. So you were right in a way, and this happened in a way, and now let's move forward.
Yeah, that's a possibility. Although if you came across a tribe of people living on a volcanic island that worshiped the volcano as a god, would you begin your argument with them by saying, yeah, it's a god, but actually there are thermal forces underneath and lava and then periodically blah, blah, blah? I think you have to use reality. I don't think you can say your myth is kind of true and you can keep living at the base of this volcano because, myths are okay.
You can say your myth is kind of true and maybe you have to move for other reasons. I find it thinking of human history and religious beliefs and various things that people think, it's very hard I think you somehow have to let people have their myths and find a way to move on in a productive way.
So the problem is that there are multiple myths at work here. And the most pernicious is that there are two that are bad. One is that nuclear weapons give us power, and that's false. And the other is that nuclear weapons will keep us safe in perpetuity.
Right.
And people know at some level that those are not true.
Right.
People know that those are myths. And what you need to do is, but they need to believe in them because they've told that nuclear weapons will always exist and there's nothing we can do about it. So in order to get them to stop believing in their myths, what they need are realistic hopes. Because in the absence of realistic hope, of course you believe in myths.
Well, but not all of them say they want to get rid of them. Here I have the current issue of Peace Magazine, which has an article called Touch History and Take a Selfie. It's about a Toronto woman who's reported on having visited the museum in the Bradbury National Science Museum at Los Alamos, which is a place where they have replicas of the Hiroshima bomb and all the other beautiful things. And she talks about walking with horror through this place, and she sees people taking pictures of themselves in front of this bomb, really selfies about how they're proud that they owned such a wonderful thing as this bomb. And she feels a little horror. So as she's going out, she meets a woman and she's muttering to herself about what a horrible thing this is. And the woman gets very upset and angry with her because she says, this bomb saved my father's life. And he would have had to invade Japan and would have been killed there. And it saved the lives of thousands of American soldiers. And so I'm extremely grateful to it. And I'm angry with anybody who wants to put it down. We should be very thankful that we had such a thing. Well, so that's a little different. And I guess the question for me is, what does this myth do for the people who believe that Hiroshima ended the war, the bomb ended the war, or even the Nagasaki bomb ended the war? In what way does it make them feel better? I don't care whether it makes them feel better or worse, but how does that impact their notion of what to do in the future? Why do people then say, well, therefore we want to keep them, and we in fact maybe even want more, and we want to keep them up to date and have the very best of the bombs, etc. So what is the impact of this myth on policy today for the future?
Well, there are several things. First, people believe that nuclear weapons keep us safe and that deterrence can't fail. And so, or at least they claim they believe that, although they don't act that way. 58% of millennials were recently polled and asked if they thought that a nuclear weapon would be exploded somewhere in the world in the next 10 years, and they said yes. And then they were asked if, this was a survey by the International Red Cross. Then they were asked if they thought there'd be a World War II type war in their lifetime, and they said yes. So obviously people may believe that nuclear weapons keep them safe, but they also believe this other thing, that they'll get used and that there'll be a giant war. And so those are contradictory things.
Yeah.
The claims about nuclear weapons are these: nuclear weapons keep us safe, nuclear weapons uphold our alliances, and in fact, maybe they even uphold the world order. The world order makes US prosperity possible. Nuclear weapons also provide status. So basically, nuclear weapons are like a benevolent God. They give us everything that is good in life. They give us safety, they give us prosperity, they give us status. Why would you ever want to be against nuclear weapons? The only reason to be against them is that none of that is real.
Well, let's take them apart, though, because I would say I don't believe they give us security, obviously, but I kind of think, yeah, they give us status, because people really think that the measure, the proof that you're in the big league, that you're really a powerful nation, consists of whether you have nuclear weapons. And power, I don't know what to call about that, but look what happened to Libya. Libya was on the way, or had nuclear weapons, or at least we're working on it. And they said, okay, we're going to give them up. That's it. That's it. Gaddafi said, no more of this. And look what happened to Gaddafi. He winds up in a ditch. But so don't you think that Mr. Kim in North Korea took a message from that? If you don't want to wind up in a ditch someplace, you better have some nuclear weapons. And it's a proof that they have to take you seriously. If you have nuclear weapons, they're going to treat you differently if you're a nuclear power. I think there's truth in that, even though certainly I don't think there's a bit of truth in the notion that they give you security.
Well, so that's a useful thing to think about in terms of history. And I think in this case, the history of battleships is a very useful thing to contemplate. Battleships at the turn of the 19th century, 20th century were the currency of power. They were the weapon you had to have in order to be a great power. You counted the number of battleships and compared the number in each country to figure out the rank order of who was most powerful. Mm-hmm. All of the interwar years between World War I and World War II were devoted to diplomacy to limit battleships, because people were sure that they were the cause of the war. And battleships gave you status. They were the status symbol. And none of it had anything to do with military utility.
So
the British found out.
What
the British found out at the beginning of World War I is that if they sailed their battleships near Germany, torpedo boats, small, inexpensive, fast, would sink them. They found out that submarines could sink them. And that's why the British Navy was locked up in Scapa Flow throughout most of the war. And in World War II, the lesson was driven home even more harshly when dive bombers sank any battleship they found in the open water. So the problem with status symbols is, yeah, people will treat you differently if you have a status symbol, but that's not reality. And you may find, as the Germans did, who built tons and tons of battleships and could never use them, that you've wasted your money, that you've misspent your defense dollars, that you're now engaged in a war you cannot win because your status symbols aren't effective weapons.
That's interesting. By the way, why I never knew this and never thought about the importance or the lack of importance of battleships in World War II. But why was it the Germans couldn't use theirs? You said they couldn't. What did they plan to use them for and then find they couldn't use them for?
Germans tried to have an arms race with the Brits. They built about a third or a third as many battleships as the British did, and then they couldn't sail out into the North Sea because the British would find them and sink them because they had superior numbers. A better example, but the arms race in battleships brought Great Britain into the war. Before the Germans started building battleships, the Brits were ambivalent about whether they would support Germany or France in a European war. But the more battleships that Germany built, the more threatened Britain felt, and the more likely they decided the more they decided they had to side with the French. So the German battleships actually lost them the war because they brought Great Britain in on the side of the French. And the British battleships, they built 16 between 1911 and, no, they built 30 in the years between 1911 and 1916. And they bankrupted the country. Maybe they didn't, that's an exaggeration. They didn't bankrupt the country. But the cost of spending money on these giant weapons that were essentially useless was one of the contributing factors to the decline of the British Empire following World War I and then after World War II.
Yeah. Ward, I'm sort of interested. I mean, I agree that it would be good if people didn't believe in myths, but then you look at what's happening right now. Britain going for the fourth Trident at a huge, huge cost. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure they don't care what their millennials think or anyone thinks. I mean, it's some psychological bizarreness that's causing that. I don't think that the 1.1 trillion upgrade that the Americans are going through has really any rationale except getting more businesses and so forth for various states of various senators. So it's kind of divorced from reality, and we're giving reality-based arguments to get them to stop. So I don't know what, I'm so impressed with what Obama tried to do and how he was unable to do anything and then presided over the biggest buildup of nuclear arms, forever. How can we stop that cycle? I don't think the people doing it really believe much in nuclear weapons at all. They just believe in having the jobs and so forth and the prestige of having these high-tech jobs.
So nuclear weapons policy is set by a small group of experts and government officials. Mm-hmm. They move back and forth between academia and government posts. You could probably fit all of them into the large hall in Carnegie Hall, which seats 2,300. All of them in the United States could fit in that one space. Maybe they wouldn't even fill it. Mm-hmm. It's a very small group. They mostly talk to each other. They're all educated at the same graduate schools. They all study the same international relations textbooks. They believe Thomas Schelling is the source of all wisdom. And they mostly just talk to each other. They don't listen to out. They know that they're realists and everyone else is an idealist. And any objection to nuclear weapons is, on its face, ridiculous and unrealistic. So they never have to listen to anyone talking reality to them about nuclear weapons. And the result is that policy is made by this small minority. And the reason that reality works as an argument is not that you'll persuade those 1,000, 1,500 people, because their whole careers depend on it. Their prestige, their identity is all locked into this myth. The reason reality works is because you can talk to ordinary people in a bar and say, look, the nukes are dangerous and they're not very useful. And here's the proof, and we ought to get rid of them. People in the United States are looking for an excuse to get rid of nuclear weapons. Polling across 40 years has shown that nuclear weapons are not very popular. We Americans would like to get rid of nuclear weapons, But our policy is in the hands of the small minority that insists that they are the only realists and any objection is foolishness. So I think the way to use realism is to talk to ordinary people, and with a large scale movement of people who say to their congressmen and their city councils and their governors and to the president, we have to get rid of nuclear weapons. They then become more influential than a small group of people who are making doubtful arguments that can be rebutted with rational arguments.
I won't go on this, but in 2009, when Obama had the Prague speech and so forth, everyone was so optimistic, and his advisors. All that is derailed by one Republican senator who absolutely.
No, actually, the problem is
Okay.
Obama said we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons, and the American people didn't respond because the American people have been told again and again that nuclear weapons will always exist. There's nothing that can be done about it. It's a myth that you could ever get rid of them in any. And so the problem is, in order for a large scale political movement to get rid of nuclear weapons to work, you have to have realistic arguments that the weapons are dangerous and clumsy and can go and should go. So
I think both of you are right. I mean, you're saying sometimes, that people really want to get rid of them. And I think they do, but they don't want to very much, because the next thing you say is they didn't respond to Obama's offer, let's get rid of them. They didn't dance in the streets. They said, well, okay, if you want, like that. And that is the problem, because my answer is every poll that I have seen, and I once, a couple of years ago, I looked at like 20 or 30 polls, everything I could find on Google, all the previous polls asking whether people all around the world wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons. And with the exception of two small polls, every country, the majority of people said, yes, get rid of them. One of them was in Israel, and the other one was briefly in Pakistan. So, and that was just momentary and just barely, in other words, they were around 50%. Everybody else, and Canada was around 75, 80%, all the polls that we've done. And there's been another one very recently, which I don't even remember the numbers, but it's in the same ballpark. Okay, so people say they want to get rid of nuclear weapons, but they don't actually go out and demonstrate to get rid of nuclear weapons. They are sort of inured to the fact that, okay, they haven't gone off so far, so maybe they're not as dangerous as we think they might be. Therefore, we got other things to worry about. And well, I guess other people are used to it. And therefore, if somebody wants to get rid of them, that's fine with me, but I'm not going to stick my neck out. So we're in a democracy in which the majority of people want to get rid of them, but they don't want to enough to demand it. And they're not, therefore, the other part is it's economic.
No, I think you're wrong. I think your description of the situation is not correct.
No?
I think that the problem is, let's imagine that you lived in a house under a cliff and there was a giant boulder teetering just above your house. And you had complained to people and said, we've got to do something about this boulder. And everyone pointed to it and said, that boulder's too heavy. There's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing that can be done. And so two things would happen. If someone came to you and said, gee, don't you wish you could get rid of that boulder? You'd say, oh, yeah, I do. Because it's a danger. You can see it looming over your house. But if someone said, let's spend some money to see if we can figure out an option for getting rid of the boulder, you'd say, oh, don't talk to me about that. And the reason is, the only way to live with a danger that's looming over your head is to ignore it. If you worry about it every day, it'll drive you crazy. Mm. And so the reason that people put nuclear weapons out of their minds is that it's the only way they can live with the concern they have that there's going to be a nuclear war. Except when people ask them directly and say, do you think there'll be a nuclear war? They never talk about the risks of nuclear war. Think about that. In a democracy, and the United States is still at least partially a democracy, in a democracy, the way you get good policy is you get the most number of people to discuss the problem.
Mhm, mhm.
But we don't do that about the risk of the dangers of nuclear weapons because we're so sure that there's nothing that can be done, that our only psychological defense is to say, we'll never discuss this problem. We'll never think about it, because if we worried about it, it would kill us. So here's the thing. What people want is a realistic solution to the problem. And if you give them a realistic solution to the problem, let's say one day a guy comes along and says, oh, that boulder, it's actually kind of leaning over your house, but it's kind of tilting another way. And if we put a lever in and just applied a little pressure, it'll roll down the other way. Everyone would be on board with that. But the reason no one wants to talk about nuclear weapons or protest or commit emotional energy to it is because they know nothing can be done. The reason they know nothing.
I don't disagree, because I think everything you said is right. But there's another element that you haven't mentioned, which is that there are financial advantages and considerations involved. They have made sure that in every state of the US, there's some factory or some installation that is part of the whole nuclear weapons complex. I understand. I'm not, I don't know, but I've heard this is true, that the senators want to make sure that every country has its finger in the pie and is going to get a plum out of it. So there are workers who depend on this for jobs, and there's certainly investors who depend on it for their income. I believe that it's true that many of our pension plans are invested in banks which spend money on the companies that make parts and things for nuclear weapons. And therefore there would be some dislocation if all these banks said, well, we're not going to invest anymore in companies that do this kind of work, and we're going to shift over to something else. Now, I think that to be realistic in this regard, what you have to do is you don't go out and say, take your money out of the bank and shut down this plant. We have a plant here that is making armored personnel carriers to sell to Saudi Arabia to use against Yemen. And the public doesn't like this, but there's so much money involved that we don't want to back out of it, because it would cost a hell of a lot of jobs. So I think in order to go to a place and say, shut down this plant because it's doing bad things that are dangerous or immoral, you in the same breath ought to say, and now what we want to do is convert this plant to a plant that makes blah, 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 whatever, something environmentally, turbines for wind power or something like that, which convert this plant. You're not going to lose your job. We're going to still save the investment, and you'll make some money from it, and it'll be good for the environment. So I think we have to combine the economic arguments with the military.
That's probably what he's going to do in the next book. I don't know.
Well, there's no question that getting rid of a particular weapon that we used to spend $58 billion a year on would cause dislocation. But, in the cutting back on people smoking tobacco caused dislocation in the tobacco industry, but it was clearly the right thing to do. And shifting away from oil-based cars to electric cars is, painful for a much larger industry. But if it's the right thing for the United States to do, then it's something that we simply, as you say, do it, modify our current systems, hire less nuclear weapons workers and more hospital workers, or, school teachers or something else.
When you talk to because I remember watching the hearings when John Kyle was not allowing one thing that Obama wanted. How would you counteract talking to the Republican senators, who are probably the same now as they were then, absolutely not allowing one jot of diminishment of nuclear weapons?
Well, there are two things to say about that. One is I would use realist arguments with them. I had a meeting with Lindsey Graham's foreign policy guy, and he didn't jump on and say, yeah, let's get rid of nuclear weapons. But he said, this is really interesting. I want to know more about this. I want you to keep me informed.
Okay.
So one thing you can do is to talk to the people who take these issues seriously and aren't just doing political posturing because they think it's what people want. But the real way to get Jon Kyl not to support blocking all nuclear weapon stuff is to go to his home state and get a petition with 50,000 signatures on it. And when he sees the movement in the population in his home state, that changes the ball game. They're politicians. You know, they want to keep their jobs. And so, you know, there are some people who will commit political suicide for an ideal or a belief, but most politicians will change their minds if you pressure them. And I think the way to get people, ordinary people involved, is to give them a realistic, to change their perception that nothing can be done, and give them a realistic plan for getting rid of the weapons that sounds sensible, that keeps the United States safe, that doesn't involve us putting down our arms while everybody else has them, but everyone in the world goes down together. And you talk about something that sounds sensible and realistic, and that allows us to avoid the danger of nuclear war. And people will sign on to that. I think ordinary people especially want to live their lives, and you know, it's hard enough to get by without having to worry about a nuclear war in 10 years.
Right.
Okay. Have we disposed of all the other four arguments? I think we.
No.
Which is your favorite of the other four arguments? We only have room for one more argument.
Well, I guess my favorite is the "you can't disinvent nuclear weapons" argument.
Uh-huh.
And I like it so much because it's such a ludicrous argument.
It's easy to dispose of that one, huh?
Yeah.
Well, it's difficult to dispose of because it's absolutely true. You cannot disinvent nuclear weapons, but the reason you can't do it is because there's no such process as disinvention. There are no guys in lab coats sitting around in a big room and the boss brings in a piece of technology and puts it on the table and says, "Okay, Bob, disinvent this. Boss wants it done by the end of the week." That doesn't happen. The notion that you can't get rid of nuclear weapons is based on a misapprehension about how technology goes away. And it goes away one of two ways. One, people, either something better comes along. You know, you've got a fork and then you have a fork that also has a spoon on part of it. So, you know, they say, "This is great, this is better." Or they realize it was stupid technology to begin with because conditions have changed or for whatever. The ancient Egyptians built, you know, those ancient ships that had a row of oars and then they had two rows, one below decks and one on top. These guys, Ptolemy IV, built a ship that had 40 rows of guys with oars. And it was quite a status symbol, but it was militarily useless. It was so slow that all the little small fast ships could go around and avoid it. And then the battle was decided by those ships, not by the giant one. So it was useless, and they figured out it was useless, and no one ever built another ship that had 40 rows of oars on it. So if you can show that nuclear weapons are relatively useless and very dangerous, then they'll go away just because people will stop believing in them. You don't have to disinvent. So you don't have to disinvent stuff in order to get it to go away. You just have to convince people it's not very useful and it's dangerous.
Okay, you convinced me, but I wasn't pretty hard to convince. Martha, are you convinced?
I thought they were very good arguments. Yes.
Okay, this has been fun, and I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing. So come back and we'll have another argument.
All right, I will. I'll come back.
I believe in arguments. Yeah.
Let me just advertise myself for a second. If people are interested, they can go to www.realistrevolt.org, which is the website for the organization I work for. And I just recently published a series of 4 articles called How to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons that lay out the outlines of the case that nuclear weapons can, in fact, be realistically eliminated.
All right.
So they can search for them.
So we will have a conversation about that. Okay.
Very
Big
good.
deal. All right. Terrific. Thank you both. And carry on. We've got to get rid of the damn things, huh?
Thanks, Ned. And thanks, Ward. Nice to see you.
Okay.
Nice to see you, Martha.